Hi, this is Susan Holmes. This is the first of many videos that I'm going to be publishing about the corruption that's taking place in Fort Collins, Colorado. I recently published an evidentiary documentary proving that the district attorney of Fort Collins lied about my son, Jeremy Holmes, my 19-year-old son, who was slaughtered on the streets of Fort Collins in July 2017. From the moment they killed my son, they organized immediately with what is called a SIRT team, S-I-R-T. This is the supposed investigatory team that happens when an officer kills a student or any other citizen in a city. Now, they organized this team within a half hour of killing my son in the evening. When I went to the emergency room to see my son, the whole team was there waiting for me. I didn't understand this, what was taking place. It was very, very confusing. I was in shock to find out that they'd actually killed my son, my 19-year-old son. When I had to wait and wait, they wouldn't let me see my son by myself. They wouldn't let me go in and just see my son. Eventually, they called me into a room in the hospital. And then, all of a sudden, the coroner walked in and about 8 or 9 other people walked in. They were all sitting there. And what I didn't know is that I was being recorded in the emergency room prior to seeing my son. Now, the coroner told me in front of all these people, there was no privacy. I was never taken aside privately and told what happened with my son. No, this was a performance that was taped. It was intentional because from the beginning, they were going to cover up the death of my son. And this is how they ambushed a mother in the emergency room. They ambushed me. The coroner told me in front of all these people that my son had been killed. Now, I said over and over again, why? My son was not a criminal. My son's not a criminal. I made that statement many, many times in that emergency room while I was crying. One of the persons who was sitting next to me, there was this so-called victims advocate from the police department. By the way, victims advocates from the police department are not your advocate. They work for the police. They do not keep anything confidential. They are not representing you. This is part of how their operation is run in Fort Collins. Is your victim advocate is supposed to sound like they're doing something for you, but really she's there to report anything you say to her to the investigation. So never trust a victim's advocate, number one. Number two, there was a man there who apparently was a pastor who was sitting next to me, and I wasn't even aware of anybody, but I could feel his hand on my shoulder when I was crying. And at some point it hit me. Wait a minute. I don't want my son's body touched in any way. You cannot take an organ or skin, take anything from my son. It just hit me out of the blue like, I've got to make sure that they don't take anything from my son. And immediately the man who was rubbing my shoulder, his hand paused and he said to me, "Not any tissue?" Not even any tissue? And I said, no tissue, no organs are to be taken from my son. This is what I had to deal with prior to even seeing my child, who an hour earlier was alive. That's just a few details from the emergency room. So you can see that I was not even being treated like a mother who lost her child. I was being treated like a criminal. I was being recorded and I didn't realize it. I was in shock. I was in trauma. And I was ambushed by this team from Larimer County that was organized within half an hour to cover up the death, the homicide, the slaughter of my 19-year-old son, Jeremy. Why were they so organized? Why? Because it was a police officer who killed him. That is why they organized. They won't organize like that for you when someone else gets killed. They only organize like this for people who are part of the police blue cult. And that's really what it is, the police brotherhood. They'll organize. Now, you're going to hear some negative things from me about the police, and they're justified. And I want people to understand the things I'm going to share with them because it's from my personal experience. Because I fought from the very beginning to find out what happened to my son, and they wouldn't tell me one thing. They wouldn't tell me one thing. 2 weeks after that emergency room ambush, the DA published the Jeremy Holmes letter, which I didn't even know at that time was the criminal investigation. No one would tell me. I called. I was given cards from the people in the room. I had piles of cards. I would call them and say, what's going on? What's happening? No one would tell me anything. We can't do anything. Investigatory privilege. Investigatory privilege is toxic. That is the language used by police to protect and cover police homicides. Remember that. Investigatory privilege. It should not exist. In fact, police should not be investigating police at all because they are completely biased. And in my son's case, that was true. I found out that the sheriff's department that was overseeing this investigation was also employed at Colorado State University. It was a Colorado State University police officer who killed my son, who confronted my son with a gun and killed him. Almost everyone involved in this investigation were employees of Colorado State University. The judges who heard my open records case were from or affiliated with Colorado State University. Or they were from the DA's office. Now, one thing that I'm going to be addressing a couple issues here just in this video. I'm going to try and keep this short because I'm going to do more. But the one concept I want the public to understand, the one piece of information that is so important for people to take in, is they have to realize the police, the district attorney's office, and the police are not here to protect you. That is a huge fallacy that has been promoted for decades in our country. You must understand now, for the sake of our country, that the police and district attorneys are not here to protect you. They are only here to protect themselves. They are government employees. They're government employees, and they protect each other. And in the case of a district attorney and police officers, they are protecting their fellow employees because of liability in the city. They are not there to protect you at all. Once an officer kills a citizen, that officer is allowed to walk free, generally, almost in every case, because of qualified immunity. The DA always justifies the officer's killing, just as the DA justified the killing in my son's case, which was completely a horrific and outrageous justification. There are so many details to my son's story, and I'm just going to begin to talk about them. But I wanted to talk about how they establish what the police do in order to protect themselves, and what the DA does is they create false narratives. And then they withhold any body camera footage that's involved for months. They withhold it so the family can never know the truth. This allows the DA and the police to establish their false narrative. The media repeats it over and over again, so the family never gets a chance to find out what really happened and to tell the truth and to confront the DA or the police about what they've done. The media won't report it either. In my case, the Coloradoan worked with the DA and the police to suppress my objections. The Coloradoan, I contacted him 3 or 4 different times. Once I saw the DA's opinion that was published in July, I immediately knew that they were lying about my son, because I knew the facts that they were stating in there, that they're presenting as facts, were false. I was having a very hard time struggling with the trauma of what happened to my child. And then to read how they were gaslighting me. They were gaslighting my family. They were gaslighting the public. I was having a very hard time. I was sick. It's very, very difficult to deal with seeing your son in a casket, knowing you couldn't even see the top of his head, knowing you can't see portions of his body because of the autopsy. Okay, major point that I want to convey here is the establishment of a negative narrative in the case of Jeremy Holmes. Number 1, the police lied to the media and said the mother, Susan Holmes, made a 911 emergency phone call. They made it sound like I called them as an emergency issue to go hunt my son down. Hunt him down and kill him. That's the implication. But it was a false implication. Why? Because I never made a 911 emergency phone call. Oh, let it sink in. The police lie. They lied about the 911 emergency phone call. It's false. I have the phone records to prove that it was not a 911 emergency phone call. I have the phone records. But because they established the narrative and because the Coloradoan backed them up on their false narrative for months and withheld information from me, and the Coloradoan refused to let me publish an article to disabuse the community of what the DA determined. I asked the Coloradoan 3 times to publish an advertorial where I could dispute the DA's findings, and they refused to let me. So, number one lie, the mother made an emergency phone call to 911. False. I did not do that. Number two lie is that Jeremy was a criminal. That he charged the police officer because it's in their body camera footage. Number two lie, the DA set it up in his criminal conclusions at the end of July that Jeremy would have been charged as a criminal for charging the police officer. That's a complete, utter lie. It's bullshit. Jeremy never was a criminal his whole life. He was an incredible, brilliant person. Jeremy was immediately suicidal when the officer jumped out of his car with his gun pointed at him. But remember, the DA got to establish this narrative because they refused to let me see the body camera footage. Now here's the other factor here. The body camera footage has been altered. Images have been deleted. They've inserted images into it. I know they have. But they wouldn't let me see the body camera footage for 4 months. The only reason why I got to see it in 4 months was because CBS was on them. That's the only reason why. Otherwise, they would have kept me from seeing that body camera footage for a year or more, possibly, just like they're doing in the rest of Colorado in other cases. The only reason why they were forced to let me see it is because CBS got involved. Now, I know that body camera footage has been altered. So that's the other part of their narrative. They get to put all this information that's completely false based on their body camera footage and based on the fact that, they're police and you must trust everything they say because, we all know police are honest, right? We know DAs are honest. No, they're not. They're liars. Now, when I ran for city council here in Fort Collins to change the conditions that I found myself in, number one. Number two, I filed an open records lawsuit to get the unredacted body camera footage and audio, original, time-stamped, raw copies, because that's what forensics labs need in order to do an analysis and authenticate the video and the audio. So I filed a lawsuit to get it. I was asking for it from the very beginning. But they refused to give me those copies. CSUPD, the police department for Colorado State University, refused to give me the unredacted video and time-stamped audios. They refused to give them to me. So I did the lawsuit and I lost. That lawsuit dragged on for 7 months because they went through so many judges. Why? Because their intention was to delay it as long as possible. But that's another story. The fact is, the body camera footage, the judge found for CSU against me, Susan Holmes, in providing me copies of the unredacted body camera footage and unredacted raw time-stamped audio. Why? Because she came out of the DA's office. Her good buddy, the DA, Cliff Rydell, none of these guys are ever going to find against him because there's a ring of corruption in Fort Collins. There's a criminal ring of corruption with the judiciary, with the DA's office, with the police departments, including CSUPD. They all work together. You don't have to take my word for it. The Timothy Masters case has proven that there's been an ongoing conspiracy in this town to suppress evidence and the truth about any cases where the DA or the police are involved. That's a fact. Just look up the Timothy Masters case. The very DA that said my son was a criminal when he was suicidal, the very DA who lied about the fact that my son was going into the village when I proved in my evidentiary documentary that my son never went into the village. There was no reason to intercept him. He hadn't harmed anyone. He hadn't done anything to anybody. But Phil Morris jumped out at him with his gun out and created a situation that put my son into a suicidal state. He felt like he had no choice but to die. He tried to dialogue with Officer Phil Morris, but Phil Morris refused to talk to him. Phil Morris refused to tell him, hey, Jeremy, we can help you. Let's go to the hospital. You've got an issue, let's go. Not Phil Morris. You know why? Because Phil Morris is a violent offender, another criminal, part of the ring of corruption in Fort Collins. Officer Phil Morris brutalized somebody earlier in 2014. Had 3 witnesses on campus. Guess what? DA Rydell's office cleared him, even though there were 3 witnesses to the brutality. DA Rydell cleared Officer Phil Morris of the slaughter of my son, Jeremy Holmes. He justifies his actions, which are really not justified. I took that apart in my evidentiary documentary. That link will be provided below. There's a ring of corruption in Fort Collins amongst the law enforcement leadership in the DA's office. And by the way, the state attorneys, the governor's attorneys, were the ones who tried the case against me in the open records case that I filed. They were the attorneys in this case. Okay? So the state of Colorado was instrumental in suppressing my access to unredacted body camera footage. The state of Colorado, the state attorney's office. Colorado State is suppressing access to body camera footage, unredacted body camera footage. That's a fact. Not only that, when I took over my case, I had to fire my attorney in May because he was throwing my case. But when I took it over, I had to talk with the state attorneys who were, working against me. But you know what? When I spoke with them, I told them everything. I didn't care if they used it against me. I told them every fact I knew. I told them the body camera footage has been altered. I told them the audio was altered. And I have evidence of the audio being altered because guess what? They sent me splices of audio from I don't know where, and they put them all together. That's absolute evidence that they cut tapes up and put them together. I have copies of that. The state attorneys know that because it was one of their attorneys who sent me that file. That's evidence of the police altering all kinds of videotapes to compile them into one with no timestamps. Fake audio. The state attorney's office knows this. When I gave them all these details and I pointed out all these facts, I then said to them, now forward this to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Go ahead, forward it. I want you to do that. Did Colorado state attorneys forward the information in my opens records case, the evidence that I provided that the tapes were altered and the audio was altered? Did they forward that to the U.S. Attorney's Office? I don't know. But guess what? The public knows now, and I'm going to keep letting the public know. The Coloradan will never tell you the truth. Mainstream media will never tell you the truth about what's happening in Fort Collins. I'm going to tell you the truth. Northern Colorado has a ring of corruption, and it's run by government employees. Susan Holmes.